All right, gang, we are back and we are in chapter 13.2. Your pages are 427 to 431, and today we are going to look at the Texas Revolution. You see Texas in bright red here on the map. All right, so our learning objective for today, we're going to explain how Texas gained its independence from Mexico and became an independent nation in the 1830s. That there is the state flag of Texas. A little bit of review to bring you up to speed. So beginning in the early 1800s, many Americans began moving west. In 1803, the United States buys the Louisiana Territory from France. Much of what is now the southwestern United States was part of the Spanish Empire at the time, and by that we're talking about like Arizona, New Mexico, Texas. And then we'll get to Mexico winning independence from Spain in 1821, but let's get after our new content for today. All right. So I'm going to do my best to pronounce these highlighted words the way they're supposed to be pronounced. So Tejas, or Texas as we call it, was a large area that bordered the Louisiana Territory. In Tejas, one might find forests, lush soil, and wide plains. But however, there were very, very few settlers in such an enormous area. There's a beautiful picture of Texas right there. I've never been to Texas, but I think that's really pretty. But yeah, huge area. You know, Texas is enormous. And at the time, there were very, very few people there. So Tejanos were people of Spanish heritage who called Texas or Tejas their home. At most, so only 5,000 Tejanos lived in what is now Texas. So that is definitely sparsely populated. 5,000 people doesn't go very far when you're stretched over such a big area. So hardly anybody lives there. So there'd be some problems in Tejas at this time. So one problem facing the area in those days was ongoing conflict with hostile Native American tribes, like the Comanche, who were nicknamed Lords of the Plains. So defending the land from Native Americans became a goal of Spain. Remember, Spain still is the colonial holder of Mexico, what we will come to know as Mexico. So here's some changes in Spanish Texas. In order to protect this land from hostile Native Americans, Spain began offering tracts or huge areas of lands to folks called empresarios. Now, it was the job of an empresario to find settlers for those giant tracts of land. Spanish settlers didn't respond to these offers of land. They weren't interested in coming up and filling in that giant space. So Spain ended up letting Americans from just east of this area settle in that space. But they could be there as long as they agreed to obey Spanish laws. But as fate would have it, in 1821, Mexico wins its independence from Spain. Go Mexico! So this is a fellow named Stephen Austin. Stephen Austin wanted to establish an American colony in Texas. So he traveled all the way down to Mexico City. Anybody remember what the original name of Mexico City was? I'll let you look it up. He travels down to Mexico City to ask the Mexican government for permission to establish a colony. Mexico agreed to this, but arriving settlers would have to meet some conditions. One was that they would have to become Mexican citizens. Okay, right here. And they would all have to convert to Catholicism. Almost everybody coming from the United States West in this era is Protestant, not Catholic. So this is going to cause some unhappiness and some resentment in those people that are coming over from the United States. So between 1821 and 1825, Stephen Austin brings about 300 families to Texas to settle. And anyone who wished to settle in this country needed to prove that they were hard workers before they were allowed into the settlement or the colony. More and more settlers continued to arrive. Some of them were looking to get rich. Some of them were on the run from the law. And many of these settlers came from the South. That's going to be important when we talk about some of the new laws that the Mexican government introduces. So by 1830, 25,000 people had settled in the area. And that meant there were 6 times more Americans in Texas than Tejanos. So Tejanos are way outnumbered by the Americans at this point. All right, so we're going to look at the rising tensions in Texas during this period. So Americans continued to pour into this area, and they began to clash with Mexican authorities. So what were the disagreements? What were they clashing over? Well, the first thing was Mexico banned slavery in 1829. Many slave owners who came from the United States wanted to grow cotton in Texas. They could make a lot of money off it. And for that, they needed slaves. Well, you couldn't have slaves in Mexico anymore. And remember, Texas was a state in Mexico at this time. So they were out of luck. There was a lot of resentment from that. Official documents in Texas were all written in Spanish. And then settlers resented Mexican laws. You can see how unhappy this guy is right here. He's not really thrilled with the arrangement in Texas at the time. So over here, this guy, he represents Mexico. He's not very happy either. Well, what were the Mexicans not very happy with? Well, they felt like Americans acted like they were superior to everyone. They felt like Americans demanded special privileges and treatment, and they complained that Americans would not adopt or could not understand Mexican laws. So both sides are pretty unhappy with the way things are. So here's Mexico responding to the tension. So Mexico learned that some settlers were discussing a revolution. So they cracked down hard on Texas. And here's what Mexico did. They closed the state to further American immigration, meaning they weren't going to take anybody else into these American colonies in Texas anymore. It was not going to be allowed. They made Texans pay taxes. That's kind of hard to say. Texans pay taxes to the Mexican government. And they also sent Mexican troops into Texas. So these tensions are really ratcheting up right now. It's getting serious. Revolt. So Stephen Austin, the guy from a previous slide, he returns to Mexico City to ask the government for reforms. You can tell that tensions are really, really building, and he wants to kind of release some of the pressure there. So he wanted Texas to continue being a state in Mexico, but he wanted Texas to be able to govern itself. No more orders coming from Mexico City. Mexico was led by the dictator Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, and he believed that Austin was part of a rebellion. So Santa Anna puts Austin in jail, and the already Texans were ready to rebel, or the already angry Texans were ready to rebel. This is Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. He's on the previous slide. So by the fall of 1835, tensions had continued to escalate, and by the end of the year, Texans had driven Mexican soldiers away from an old mission in San Antonio called the Alamo. Raise your hand digitally if you've heard of the Alamo. It's still there in San Antonio. Here's a drawing of the Alamo from the 1800s. So in March of 1836, Texans met to discuss the situation and their problems with Santa Anna's troops. They declared Texas a free and independent republic, no longer a part of Mexico. They've declared their own independence. And Sam Houston was made the leader of the Texas Army. The Mexican army surrounded a much smaller group of Texas soldiers in the Alamo. And after a 13-day siege, 1,800 Mexican soldiers stormed the Alamo. Texas only had 180 men at the Alamo, and they were quickly overrun. At the end of that day, all but 7 defenders were dead. And those survivors, those 7, they were later executed. So after getting their clock cleaned by the Mexican army, Houston's army retreats all the way to the east. And other Texas soldiers are captured by Mexico, and 300 more were executed at Goliad. The Texas Army keeps growing even though it's in retreat, and so many of its soldiers have been executed. In April 1836, Houston's army surprises Santa Anna at a place called San Jacinto. Texas soldiers shouted, "Remember the Alamo and remember the Goliad," having not forgotten the slaughter at those places. Remember how many people were killed or executed? In less than 20 minutes, 18 minutes to be precise, Texans killed more than half of the Mexican army. Santa Anna signs a treaty giving Texas its freedom. All right, so then we have what is known as the Republic of Texas. It's a short-lived republic. That means Texas is now an independent nation. Its nickname is the Lone Star Republic. Texas to this day is still known as the Lone Star State. So in 1836, after winning their independence from Mexico, Texas asks to be annexed. And that means that Texas asks to join the United States. They ask Congress to admit Texas as a state. But you got to remember that slavery is still a huge issue in America at this time. The issue was so hot that Congress voted to not annex Texas. So it would remain independent for about a decade. Yes, of course, we all know we do end up getting Texas into the Union sometime later. There is a video on the last slide of this presentation that I want you to take a look at. Other than that, enjoy yourselves.